In this video, we're going to be finishing the multiplying square roots worksheet on the KutaSoftware website, and this free worksheet is found within the Geometry tab. I'll leave a link in the description below so you know how to access that. And number 13, we're going to start with distribution. So we're going to distribute the square root of 15 to the square root of 3, and we're going to distribute it to the whole number 2 with addition in between. So we have the square root of 15 times the square root of 3 plus the square root of 15 times 2. I can rewrite the square root of 15 times the square root of 3 to be the square root of 15 times 3, making sure both the 15 and 3 are within the square root, and then I can add, rearranging this, 2 times the square root of 15. Square root of 15 times 3. 15 times 3 is going to give me 45, so I have the square root of 45 plus 2 times the square root of 15. The square root of 45 I can rewrite as the square root of 3 squared, which is 9, times 5. And then I'm still adding 2 square root of 15. The square root of 3 squared times 5. The square root of 3 squared is 3 times the square root of 5. So I have 3 square root of 5 plus 2 times the square root of 15. And that is my solution for number 13. In number 14, again, I'm distributing. That square root of 6 gets distributed to the square root of 2 and to the square root of 3 with addition in between. So the square root of 6 times the square root of 2 I can write as the square root of 6 times 2 plus the square root of 6 times the square root of 3 I can write as the square root of 6 times 3. The 6 times 2 is within a square root, and the 6 times 3 is also within a square root. So the square root of 6 times 2 will give me the square root of 12 plus the square root of 6 times 3 is going to give me the square root of 18. Now the perfect square that goes into 12 is going to be 2 squared, which is 4. So I have the square root of 4 times 3, which I can write as the square root of 2 squared times 3, plus the perfect square that goes into 18 is going to be 3 squared, which is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. So 3 squared times 2 is 18. The square root of 2 squared times 3 is 2 times the square root of 3, plus the square root of 3 squared times 2 is 3 times the square root of 2. 2 times the square root of 3 plus 3 times the square root of 2 is my solution in number 14. In number 15, again, we're distributing, and there's addition in between. So I have the square root of 10 times the square root of 10, which is the square root of 10 times 10, and that's going to be added to the square root of 10 times 2. The square root of 10 times 10 is the same as the square root of 10 squared, and I'm going to rearrange this so that it says 2 times the square root of 10. So we're adding 2 times the square root of 10. The square root of 10 squared is 10, and we're still adding 2 times the square root of 10 onto that. So our final answer is 10 plus 2 times the square root of 10. In number 16, we're distributing the square root of 5. So we'll have the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, which is the square root of 5 times 5, and then we're adding the square root of 5 times 3, which is 3 times the square root of 5. The square root of 5 times 5 is the square root of 5 squared, plus 3 times the square root of 5. Square root of 5 squared is 5. So our final answer is 5 plus 3 times the square root of 5. In number 17, we're distributing the square root of 5. That gets multiplied to the whole number 5 and multiplied to the square root of 5 with addition in between. So the first term is going to be the square root of 5 times 5 plus the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, which is the square root of 5 times 5. The square root of 5 times 5 we can rewrite as 5 times the square root of 5, and then we have plus the square root of 5 times 5 is the square root of 5 squared. So we'll have 5 times the square root of 5 plus the square root of 5 squared is 5. So 5 times the square root of 5 plus 5 is our solution in number 17. Moving on to number 18, this time we're distributing the square root of 15. The square root of 15 times the square root of 3 is going to be the square root of 15 times 3. And I'm adding that to the square root of 15 times the square root of 10, which is the square root of 15 times 10. The square root of 15 times 3 is going to be the square root of 45, plus the square root of 15 times 10 is the square root of 150. My next step is to simplify both of the square roots. The square root of 45 we can rewrite as the square root of 9 times 5, which is the square root of 3 squared times 5. And we're adding that to the square root of 150, we can rewrite as 25 times 6, or 5 squared times 6, since 5 squared is equal to 25, and 25 times 6 is 150. The square root of 3 squared times 5 is 3 times the square root of 5, plus the square root of 5 squared times 6 is 5 times the square root of 6. 3 times the square root of 5 plus 5 times the square root of 6 is the solution for number 18. And number 19, I have to distribute this entire term, negative 5 times the square root of 3. I'm going to distribute it to the 2 and to the square root of 5 with addition in between. So I have negative 5 times the square root of 3 times 2 plus negative 5 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 5. Negative 5 times the square root of 3 times 2 is negative 10 times the square root of 3, since negative 5 times 2 is negative 10, and we're adding negative 5 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 5, which is negative 5 times the square root of 3 times 5. Simplifying this further, we'll get negative 10 times the square root of 3 plus negative 5 times the square root of 3 times 5, which is the square root of 15. And remember, adding a negative is the same as subtracting that positive. So you can also say negative 10 times the square root of 3 minus 5 times the square root of 15. In number 20, we're just distributing the square root of 3. The square root of 3 times 5 plus the square root of 3 times the square root of 2, which is the square root of 3 times 2. We can rewrite this as 5 times the square root of 3 plus the square root of 3 times 2 is the square root of 6. Now I'm going to distribute the square root of 10. So I have the square root of 10 times 4 times the square root of 2 plus the square root of 10 times the square root of 5. The square root of 10 times 4 times the square root of 2, I'm going to rearrange and say 4 times the square root of 10 times 2, where the 10 and 2 are both within the square root. Then I'm adding the square root of 10 times the square root of 5, which I'm going to write as the square root of 10 times 5. 4 times the square root of 10 times 2 is 4 times the square root of 20, plus the square root of 10 times 5 is the square root of 50. Now I'm going to have to simplify each of the square roots. The square root of 20 I can rewrite as the square root of 2 squared times 5, since 4 times 5 is 20, plus the square root of 50 I can rewrite as the square root of 5 squared times 2, since 25 times 2 equals 50. So I'll have 4 times 2 times the square root of 5 plus 5 times the square root of 2. 4 times 2 is 8, so my final answer will be 8 times the square root of 5 plus 5 times the square root of 2. In number 22, I'm distributing 3 times the square root of 6. And there's subtraction in between those terms. So 3 times the square root of 6 times the square root of 10 minus 3 times the square root of 6 times the square root of 3. This will be 3 times the square root of 6 times 10 minus 3 times the square root of 6 times 3. 3 times the square root of 6 times 10 is 3 times the square root of 60 minus 3 times the square root of 6 times 3 is 3 times the square root of 18. Both the square root of 60 and the square root of 18 can be simplified. So I'll have 3 times the square root of 2 squared times 15, since 4 times 15 is equal to 60, and I'm subtracting 3 times the square root of 3 squared times 2, since 9 times 2 is 18. So I'll have 3 times 2 times the square root of 15 minus 3 times 3 times the square root of 2. 3 times 2 is 6 times the square root of 15 minus 3 times 3 is 9 times the square root of 2. Number 23, again, I'm distributing with subtraction in between. Negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 4 minus negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 3 times the square root of 10. Negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 4 is negative 16 times the square root of 5, and I'm subtracting. I'm going to put parentheses around this so you don't get confused, but this is a negative 4, so I'm subtracting negative 4 times 3, which is negative 12, so I'm really adding a positive 12 times the square root of 5 times 10. Negative 16 times the square root of 5 plus 12 times the square root of 50. I can simplify the square root of 50, so I have negative 16 times the square root of 5 plus 12 times the square root of 5 squared times 2, since 25 times 2 is 50. Negative 16 times the square root of 5 plus 12 times 5 times the square root of 2. Number 23, my final solution is negative 16 times the square root of 5 plus 60 times the square root of 2, since 12 times 5 is 60. And lastly, for this worksheet, number 24. Before I go over the answer to this, please remember to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to give me a thumbs up on this video and let me know you liked it. If you have any additional comments, please feel free to leave them below. Now in number 24, we're distributing the square root of 5. So we'll have negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 6 plus the square root of 5 times 10. Negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 6 is negative 4 times the square root of 30, and that gets added to the square root of 50. Now, there is not a perfect square that goes into 30, so negative 4 times the square root of 30 is simplified, but we can simplify the square root of 50, and the square root of 50 we can rewrite as the square root of 5 squared times 2, since 25 times 2 equals 50, so our final answer will be negative 4 times the square root of 30 plus 5 times the square root of 2. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.